Um, Thanks again, everyone, so much for joining. I'm Tyler Bug and work with the team at Tech NYC. For those of you who are new to Tech NYC, we are the nonprofit membership organization representing the tech and startup communities here in New York City. We are now more than 800 member companies strong. That includes the largest tech employers like Facebook and Google, all the way down to very brand new startups and everything in between. And core to our mission is to work with our community to, number one, ensure that the innovation economy in New York thrives. And number two, ensure that New York remains the best place to build and grow a tech company. An important way that we do that is making sure that the tech sector and the tech ecosystem is well connected to the larger fabric of the city, which means that tech has to care about transit. And so we wanted to have this conversation today to really get a sense of New York City's transit infrastructure and talk a little bit about how it's been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and then dig a little deeper into some of the solutions that we can all be a part of in the road to recovery, and what we look forward to in the months and likely years to come. So with that being said, we are really excited to be joined by Danny Harris and Laura Fox. And just by way of quick introduction, Danny Harris is the Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives, which is a nonprofit advocacy organization advocating for better biking, walking, and public transit policies for all. And Laura Fox is the General Manager for City Bike here in New York City and New Jersey, which, as I'm sure we all know and use, is the public bike sharing system at Lyft. And so I just want to turn things over to them and just maybe start things off by, number one, asking Danny and Laura to just tell us a little bit more about your organizations and the work that you do. And maybe also just set the stage a little bit about what New York City's transportation infrastructure looks like, maybe even in pre-pandemic times. And we often hear that it's the largest system in the US and in North America. But what does that really mean exactly? Like, how big is, I think, the question that's interesting. But we'll turn it over to you guys.
Danny, do you want to start? No, I'll take it away. Okay. And then I think a lot of the work that Danny and Transportation Alternatives have done to look at transportation, transportation studies overall during COVID, I feel like will be really relevant here because there's been some really valuable research that Transportation Alternatives has put forward. A little bit more about City Bike. As Tyler mentioned, hopefully all of you have tried riding City Bike and taken it around the city, are members of the program, and think through what that means. I think we as City Bike, just as context, are a public-private partnership with the City of New York. So we're a very completely private company, but then partner with the city to achieve public objectives. So how do we serve the most number of people in the city? How do we deliver a really sustainable transportation option to people? Some really big things top of mind for us are this $100 million expansion that we've embarked on and are continuing to embark on over the coming years, where we're doubling the size of the current City Bike service area. That's where a lot of our time, resources, thinking are going. We've been thinking a lot about, how to make New York City resilient, especially during the pandemic. And so we can talk further about what, efforts about micromobility at large during this time and what that looks like. But during the beginning of the pandemic, we started a critical worker program to provide about 30,000 free memberships to healthcare workers, transit workers, other frontline workers to make sure that they could get to and from their jobs safely. And so I think that's a really big focus for us in this coming year. We've introduced electric bikes into the fleet in growing number. So we now have thousands of bikes on the street that are electric, that really facilitate, getting to where you need to go faster, taking a longer trip, especially if you need to go over a bridge, getting somewhere not sweaty. I know that that's kind of a funny thing to talk about, but it's definitely a deterrent and a barrier for people biking. And then, we've, in terms of big picture, where are we at right now, the transportation landscape, and I think Danny will have a lot of thoughts here, has really changed over the last 6 months. City Bike actually had our highest bike ridership month ever last month in September. And so I think that was great to see. We also had our highest ridership day ever. And that's in a landscape where, the use case of how someone is using a bicycle has completely changed from being 80% commuting to, 80% leisure or so. And so I think it's been great to see, people taking bikes out for, exercise, for leisure trips, for essential groceries trips, and really adding that to their routine and getting used to that aspect. As additional context, we've had over 500,000 new riders come into the system this year and been breaking kind of our own internal records of new people coming out and trying City Bike in a context where we don't have any tourists. And so I think that those are all great indicators that, there's huge demand for City Bike and for biking in general. I think we've seen articles about, lines around the block for bike infrastructure, bike repair, and all of that. And I think it points to, bigger questions I think are very much top of mind for Danny and I around how do we transform our streets and really think about supporting infrastructure to facilitate those new riders as they take more and more trips. So I'll stop there. Lots more to talk about.
Thanks, Laura. And thank you, Tyler. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm honored to be the Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives. We've been around for almost 50 years in New York City. And I would say quite simply that what we're trying to do is solve a pretty simple equation, which is infinitely complicated, especially in New York City. But it's one of space minus cars equals quality of life. And the same way that we were talking pre-COVID about the need to connect public space to areas across New York City that didn't have them, to address commute time, especially for people like nurses who have the longest commute time in New York City. This was significant before COVID. It's a tragedy afterwards. To address the racial inequities about planning. And if you just simply take a look at Robert Moses and you're familiar with his infrastructure, you understand that while he did build tremendous things, he also built it with barriers that did not allow people to access part of what he was building, and also did so destroying communities. So what we're seeing now is really this intersection of so many of the ways that transit has been broken and the way that it has played out, not only in New York City's past, but in its future. And I just want to start with what I think is probably, I have a lot of challenge with words. One is obviously the opportunity of this moment. The other one, which I think is equally challenging to me, is this notion that New York should go back to normal. I think we have to recognize what normal was. And I would sort of ask each of you to just think about for a moment how much of your day was spent commuting, complaining about the MTA. Maybe you were riding a bike and you were angry because, most cyclists don't start angry. We become angry largely because we're given this disingenuous invitation to access the city. And yet the city builds infrastructure like these, it's like they build half of a bridge across the East River and they don't put a gate at the end of it. And they say, well, we've done some, you have to figure out how to get across. But, we don't take responsibility for what happens when you jump off the bridge and you have to swim across to Queens. And that's largely what we've seen with, the sort of half measures of things like bike infrastructure. So now when we are thinking about what comes back, and Tyler, you'd asked about, how big was big? Yes, we were the biggest in the country in terms of public transit, and we were far from as big as we needed to be. So, places like Paris are thinking about a 15-minute city where everything that you need is within short proximity. Other cities are reimagining their streets so that they can be pathways for recovery as we need to do in New York City. But I guess what I would sort of put to this group, because I had the opportunity of working in Silicon Valley for 4 years and they're focused on philanthropy, looking at issues of affordable housing and transportation, especially as they related to the death and life of that area, is, people talk a lot about obviously the differences between Silicon Valley and New York City, and here tech being this horizontal instead of a vertical, and the difference of density and what it means to move around. I think it behooves all of us to imagine transportation as a utility when we think about the future. So in my ideal world, which I realize may not be sexy, especially as you have to go off and fund and get money from people, they want these ideas of, beautiful Times Squares and bus lanes and bike lanes, like all that I really want, I think if we're successful as a group, is that mobility and transportation, they just work. So in the morning, you turn the lights on, the lights work, you get pissed off at Con Ed the few days a year when your power goes out, but ultimately it works and you do not complain about it. I mean, have a conversation with somebody in New York about taking the subway, and like that takes up part of your day. Taking the subway, whether it works or not, is part of your day. Riding a bike is part of your day. If these things just started to work, and it's not crazy because they work in a lot of other places, things work in Japan, they work in Northern Europe. When we're seeing that bike infrastructure, there was a sinkhole in my neighborhood, it took 3 months for them to close it. In other places that would happen overnight. Like we've just sort of given ourselves this notion that normal is broken and we're okay with normal and we complain about it, but it's just part of life in New York City. When we think about coming out of this is really, I think, where the big opportunity is for us as transportation alternatives with our partners at City Bike and elsewhere, is to reimagine what this looks like, where things just work. And part of that notion of working is that we go back to the future, where simply we're prioritizing people over cars, and we're giving people safe, equitable, dignified, and sustainable options of getting around. So our future isn't that we take a car away from every single New Yorker, but simply that we give everybody a series of options, and that those who don't have options are being failed by their city, by the car manufacturers, by this other sort of litany of people who are, giving you that sense of freedom by giving you a $70,000, Ford F-150, instead of giving you options of having an F-150 if you want, and, public transit that works, and a bike or bus that works for you. So I think as maybe sort of my starting shot across the bow, it's just simply normal is broken. This is an opportunity to reimagine. We have to prioritize the things that matter the most. And our future is not Elon Musk and hyperlinks and monorails. It's simply going back to some of the basics and reprioritizing spatial design.
Yeah. And Danny, we talked about this at the very beginning. I know that you just hosted the Vision Zero conference last year and brought together, people from private sector, public sector, diverse range of backgrounds from across the US. Did you see anyone who was doing that reimagining in the US well and effectively and building a future? Because I think I, like you, have been looking at, I almost call it transportation porn, because like London and Paris, right, are really taking advantage of this moment. They're talking about these, the health benefits of installing private bike infrastructure in a way that's very collaborative across the transportation and healthcare sector, really putting it forward as key parts of a political platform. And I'm just wondering, given the recent conference, if you see some bright spots in the US too.
Yeah, so I'd say that I'd start with that there are bright spots in New York City. I think we could tell the story of New York City's recovery by simply scaling a few projects in New York City that are already working. The 14th Street busway, if you've seen it, it moved from one of the slowest buses in New York to one of the fastest. It helped to create sort of a pedestrian and bike-friendly corridor. It gave back all this space, especially in the aftermath of when they thought the L train was shutting down. We had one of those. It took almost 3 years to build. You who work in tech realize that obviously when you have the data and you've proven an innovative model, you should be scaling that across the city. So, that's a model where we should be having it across the boroughs, and we know that model works and we should be bringing more of it. Protected bike lanes are clearly working. Even Times Square, the transformation there, which, has been sort of lauded not in New York, across the world, what other neighborhoods have that? Very few. So I think even if we don't leave our own borders, we can sort of see it on our subway ride from where we live. I do think that where there are bright spots are in communities that are pretty new to this work and are thinking of leapfrogging ahead of where New York is already. So I spent 4 years in San Jose, California, and they just produced one of the most ambitious bike plans in North America. It's a huge sprawling city. They have no shortage of road space, and they've advanced the plan that I think is maybe the most ambitious in all of North America, because they have the leadership to do so. They have the space, and they realize that that they can. So I think you have cities like that are saying, let's just go really big. Then you have other places like in Seattle, where we had a conversation with Carrie Moon, who was one of the leaders of reclaiming the waterfront by, sort of, the initial idea was to remove a highway that ran through the center of downtown Seattle to give the waterfront back. What she actually shared with us, which I think is an incredible learning, especially about something like the BQE, is that she won and she lost. So Seattle got their waterfront back, but they did so by building a tunnel underneath that kept the cars going, that kept the pollution and the congestion. And now they're actually not seeing the number of cars that they had imagined. So this huge multi-billion-dollar project for maybe 30,000 cars a day, which isn't a lot. So I think that that's a really significant, bright spot from Seattle's mistake, especially as we're thinking about BQE and other elements of reimagining Robert Moses infrastructure as they come to the end of life. And then I think, we're seeing a lot of, strong leadership. We had a keynote from the mayor of Houston, who's incredibly bullish on this. And his vision is to get to Vision Zero by 2030, which is probably 15 to 20 years before New York would get there based on our current projections. So, I think it's sort of that intersection of when you have the political leadership, when you have a plan in place, and also where you're learning enough from your mistakes to try to not make them again and to scale them. Laura, I want to ask you, because one of my colleagues shared an interesting statistic with me this morning, and I want to ask you if it's true, and then ask if you could tell me a bit more about it. But I heard today, I just want to make sure I get it right, that that you're actually, I think your ridership now is higher than Long Island Railroad. Like your ridership in New York City is now higher than some of the public transit agencies, which I think is exciting and also a bit terrifying. Can you kind of dig into a bit more of that?
Yeah, definitely. And we've actually long had higher ridership on weekends than, say, Metro North, and I think Long Island Railroad. We have higher ridership than the East River ferries. I think last year we came close to beating aggregate ridership of the Staten Island ferry, and this year might actually, just given commuting volumes and things like that. So those are some of the other transportation groups that we look at as benchmarks. Yeah, I think the reality is that we're in a world where people are reconsidering transportation choices, having different use cases for transportation, right? Of taking, working from home versus taking a longer trip. And so are seeing, city bike ridership rise higher. I do want to state, as Danny mentioned, something that's top of mind for me is like, it feels good in the moment to be looking at these, mega players and to be saying city bike is higher, but ultimately, like, we as New York need our subway to come back, right? We need like Long Island Railroad to be seeing that higher ridership in Metro North. I think when I look at, that the subway is still about 25% of where it was pre-COVID. And typically it moves 60% of New Yorkers per day around the city, facilitates almost 9 million trips. Like, that's not an institution that we can afford to have fail. And so I think we feel, and in fact, like, I think a vision state future world is one in which you rent a city bike and you get a free transfer to the bus or to the subway. And so my thought is much more about how do we collaborate even closer with transportation agencies in the future, and also like welcome, eager to have conversations during this time as well, as we think about how to reimagine that. And I think separate and related to that, I think one of the big things that the MTA has been going through recently, for example, has been a dramatic budget crisis. And, Danny and I were on the surface transportation group together, which we can certainly get into more. But two of the big things that I thought about a lot during that session were things about how thinking through street redesign and thinking through cars on streets can actually yield a lot of revenue for the city that can solve a lot of other problems. And the two things that are most top of mind for me are the amount of free parking and then congestion pricing. And as Danny mentioned earlier, when we look at streets and see that cars and vehicles have 75% of the street space, we have 3 million free parking spaces throughout the city. That alone, like, I've just done the MTA has a deficit this year likely to be 7 to 9 million, and that alone, if you assume 3 million parking spaces. I did this math recently. So it was like 3 million parking spaces, 365 days a year, 24 hours, maybe you only get 50% occupancy, you're charging $1 an hour, and maybe only 50% of it is paid. That's $6.6 billion a year.
This is like everybody in our space's fantasy. This is like what keeps us up at night. It's like, what if we charge for parking? Oh my God, imagine the possibilities.
It would be amazing. And
Yeah.
I know that it's politically difficult, but like, isn't it more difficult to have our subway system fail or to not get the size of federal funding? And I think, that is very much top of mind to me, that when we talk about, I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago where a woman who had worked for the city of Denver now works on the private sector side. And she said, getting private sector companies to be excited about supporting transportation, like it's easy at first. So everyone's like, okay, yeah, transportation is really important. And then she said, and then you get to the B word, that this is billions of dollars problems. And then everyone slowly backs away. Right. And I think it's interesting to think about the fact that we actually have, levers and mechanisms within the city itself to be pulling, to be supporting these major sources of our economy, equity, and other elements within the city, whether that be that kind of sizing of paid parking, or the implementation of congestion pricing, which would bring in another couple billion.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, I think, as activists and advocates on the front line, I think, one of the things, and it sounds ridiculous, but we need to remind is like, there's no constitutional amendment that guarantees you free parking. When Moses descended from the Temple Mount, there was no sort of interpretation of the commandments that said, ye shall park your 6,000-pound vehicle wherever you want for free. And so one of the things that we're looking at a lot is that basically we're dealing with this addiction that our city and our nation has, and the addiction comes out in so many ways, not just in traffic violence, where there are 3 to 5 million people who are killed a year globally because of it, almost 40,000 in the United States, and in New York City we just passed the threshold of 200, which means that this will probably be the deadliest year in de Blasio's administration. That when we're at a very local level and fighting for these projects, even if it's something that we know works, the car manufacturers are not there. It's not us and Ford Motor Company that's saying, no bike lanes, don't charge for parking. It's that, individuals have been so accustomed to this notion that cars represent freedom because, as Henry Ford shared, the freedom of movement drives human progress. And that we tie success to cars, the type of car you have, toxic masculinity. Simply look at now the 3/4 of all American auto manufacturers that are producing cars that are so big that if my 4-year-old was in front, you couldn't even see them if you're sitting in the driver's seat. There's so many things to unpackage as a part of that, but I just sort of bring it to this very basic community level. And Laura, I know because you're at a place where you're simply just trying to give people options of removing parking spaces to put dedicated bike facilities there. The pushback at the community level is still so incredibly challenging. And if anybody has done this work, you've seen it. If not, just simply look up the story of the Prospect Park West bike lane or any of the bike lanes in your neighborhood. And it's it's like the things you shouldn't talk about in mixed company, or politics or money or parking, because these are things that everybody has really strong opinions on. But I think that when we're talking about this, especially of getting to the vision that Laura and I we both want, is you need this not just a higher level vision, but you need to start to get into some of the details about something called level of service, which is how you measure and support the movement of things on your street. So typically it's about how fast you can move vehicles. We want to reimagine it so how many people can move across that space. So you would prioritize buses, bikes, pedestrians. But it's really when you start to shift these things, the mentality and the the Hearts and Minds campaign is separate. But I really think that where we start to win is when we make these changes that mean that we're no longer fighting trench warfare, that we have a win in one neighborhood. And like you with your expansion in the Bronx, that you don't have to go to every single neighborhood and make the same case that you made before. And obviously you want to get community feedback, but we know these options work and we need to roll them out. The same way that we have roads that go everywhere, we should have this infrastructure that connects to all New Yorkers.
Yeah. And to pick up on that, I feel like I've been asked the question before of what's the definition of a city to me, and worked with a mentor named Alain Berthaud. He wrote a book essentially encompassing his 50 years working in the World Bank, and I'd been editing with it. So I feel like I had this conversation with him for about 2 years while we were going through that process. And at the end of the day, cities are really labor markets, right? And there are many other things, and they're about increasing quality of life and adding value and things like that. But cities are really about labor markets and this agglomeration of people, talent, companies, others. And if we think about our transportation network as being the thing that connects people to those labor markets, the measurement function that you're suggesting, Danny, is exactly what we would use, right? Because we would say, what's the maximum number of people that we can move in any one time? And what's the best mode to do so? Because that would not suggest the elimination of cars, right? And I don't think either of us would argue for that, but we would argue for like the reduction based on that kind of efficiency model, right? That really helps you understand how you're best moving people around. And that's the like econometrics meets urban planning meets kind of quality of life kind of scoring, which is certainly complicated.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also you just have to sort of look at where, you know, I think you have to look at where things are headed, and cities are also, and I guess I would add as a definition of a city is, you know, a city is, you know, is grounded and archaic, and it's super slow to learn, and it will, when it does learn, it will lock in infrastructure for decades, and then you'll be stuck with it. So, you know, the phone booths that became the Link NYC stations, and, you know, whatever we're going to do with electric charging, which is certainly a conversation about, you know, is a utopian future of electric AVs? Probably not. I mean, I certainly don't think so. And Laura, I'm sure you have, you know, your own opinions on that.
Yeah.
But, you know, where I do see a lot of this stuff playing out is that, you know, the infrastructure that we built, again, it's not just that we're stuck with it, but it locks people into either opportunity or lack thereof. So the economist Raj Chetty, you know, a lot of his work focuses on the fact that commuting time is one of the single biggest indicators of moving people out of generational poverty. In the asthma triangle in the Bronx, you have, you know, the worst health outcomes in all of New York State. You know, you have these things that we know to be true. We know them to be true, and we can take the data and we can look nationally. We can also look in New York City, and we have the solutions. And, you know, now, especially as it relates to what we call traffic violence, you know, we know that there's a cure. You know, Helsinki and Oslo last year had 0 pedestrian fatalities, which is, you know, they've been doing this work for longer than we have, but we know it's possible. And, you know, our city has the cure, and they're withholding it from the communities that need it the most. And so, you know, I think that us as partners in this space, and especially for those who are on the line, you know, you can't think about your business's reopening or recovery without thinking about transportation. You can't think about your employee well-being without recognizing how they're going to get to work and, you know, trying to reduce some of that friction. You can't think about the future of, you know, New York City unless you're building in a model and an understanding that, you know, our city thrives because, one, public transit is the lifeblood of the city, and two, that, you know, this porous nature of how we live allows these beautiful connections and collisions to take place. And obviously they're tragic when they're between an SUV and a stroller, but they also create incredible possibility when you are now riding your bike around and you are more inclined to go support a local business, or to ride with a friend and get exercise, or to commute to work. So, you know, again, like, maybe I'm preaching to myself or the choir of Laura or others, but, you know, if you're not thinking about transportation, and you don't have to do it with the sophistication of advocates and models and other things, but if you're not thinking about that, if that's not top of mind, you're missing this critical element of your own success and that of the community around you. And I think so much of where I feel like Silicon Valley has failed and will continue to do so is because it's like I don't know if anybody have been there, but it's just sort of a dystopian hellscape. It just looks like if the 1950s imagined the 1980s and then stopped, like that's what Silicon Valley looks like. There's nothing more disappointing than having a vision of what that place looks like and then landing in Sunnyvale and being like, what the hell is this? I was promised like flying robots and cars, and it's just like a suburban hell. And I say that lovingly, having lived there, but like, I think that's the reality. And we have this potential of completely reimagining what that looks like. And, I think that's what's super exciting about, Tyler, the work that you and your team are doing, Laura, especially that you're on the front line, and that, more companies need to see themselves as being a part of here.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting as you were talking, I was like, how do we break this down? So what are the elements and how can the Tech NYC community think about their participation too? Because as we think about getting people to move to more sustainable modes of transit, I think, Danny, your point of just like starting with the empathy of like, how are people getting back to work? How are you supporting employees? And then it seems like when we think about the picture of, okay, we want infrastructure to give people more options. And we know that infrastructure works can have impacts. One of my best or favorite case studies on this is Copenhagen in 2012 had something like 32% of people commute to work via bike, and then started a large scale infrastructure campaign to increase and double the size of their bike lanes. And they now have something like 62% of people who commute to work. So infrastructure matters, right? And that's in coordination with advocates to voice those needs to the city putting those down and dollars coming into that. Incentives, which is in part technology fueled, right? And that once you put down the infrastructure, some people will change their behavior, maybe because they were on the edge. But how do we push more people to take that mode of transportation? Which is where I think things like congestion pricing are really interesting in terms of the ability to have people recognize kind of the cost of a choice, because there are so many studies about, what it costs to really fully own a vehicle over the course of a year, but so many of those are like sunk or unseen costs. So what does it look like when you're paying ongoing? And there's some great examples coming out of both the UK, Singapore, and other places who have more successfully implemented congestion pricing. There have been mistakes along the way in terms of having too high of a price or too low. And then there's third, like from a technology layer, and then there's third from like a pure technology layer. How then can streets become more efficient once these changes are in place, and what does that look like? I was having a conversation just yesterday with Stephen Smith at Cord, who's building a dynamic curb concept for commercial vehicles for loading, unloading, to help cities better manage their commercial cord. It's thinking that we did a lot of when I was at Sidewalk Labs prior to this role of how do you, with the street space that you do have, even given these kind of optimizing functions, really optimize it for quality of life, for business purposes and others, where I think that there's a lot of potential for really innovative technology to support cities going forward.
Yeah. And I think also it's about, companies starting to ask these questions so that when they are relocating, it's something that they're asking their brokers about, that they're reaching out to their council members about. This really interesting campaign out of London that was sort of a business focused campaign for bike advocacy was all started by business. And, the guy who helped started it, he was just riding around and giving flyers to people who were walking to office buildings, and they started elevating it up the chain. And it was this kind of grassroots movement inside of some of the biggest companies in London to advance bike infrastructure as a tool to support London's economy. Mm-hmm. And it obviously had all these other side effects, but yeah, I mean, everything you said, Laura, I think you're right on.
Yeah, and to build on that, I feel like sometimes we hear things, and I don't know if you hear this, Danny, of like, oh, you're talking about like an urban utopia that's going to be bad for business. And to pick up exactly on what Danny just said, we've seen studies coming out of New York when the first kind of big protected bike lane infrastructure projects went down on 9th Avenue that saw retail sales along 9th Avenue go up 49%. That was at a time when there were some exogenous factors happening where that whole west side of the city was redeveloping. Mm-hmm. So you're like, okay, like, can we believe that or not? But then there's studies that have come out of London that have shown that cyclists spend 40% more than motorists on local businesses. And when you look at those two data points, like there's some good triangulation there, right? Where building a kind of infrastructure that's good for peds and bikers is good for local businesses, is good for macro economies of getting people to and from work in like smaller amounts of time and all of that. And so I think that these things that we're talking about aren't just about kind of, one-off street changes, but are about thinking about quality of life and our economy.
Yeah, and I think, and Tyler, I know you're trying to get in, so let me just say this
Sorry.
last thing. And I just think that, from the employer perspective too, I know we're sort of in a maybe post-Amazon idle phase where, we had it and now we're either lamenting it or happy that it went away. But, if you went through all the proposals as I and some other crazy people did, there are not like vibrant images of parking lots when, every city from, Podunk, Iowa to New York City, these are like vibrant images. And again, this was sort of in a pre-COVID age where place mattered and it was all about talent attraction and retention, and the creative class or some iteration of it was really going to sort of drive the future of cities and urban growth. But even if you think about it from the core employee attraction and retention perspective, it's about options, and especially young people and baby boomers who, up until COVID have been sort of the largest groups of people that are coming back to cities. They're looking for walkable, bikeable access to culture, local shops that are around. So, all these things are at the core, but I guess I just, maybe would leave with this prompt is, what is the image that you want your employees to see outside of your window or when they walk in for the first time? And I realize that New York City obviously has that luxury in a way that Sunnyvale may not, but New York is changing, and we have this bike boom as one side of the spectrum and Carmageddon as the other. And we sort of have both of them that are moving at the same time. But, again, when a 6,500 pound SUV is against an individual on a bike, even if it's a beautiful van move for a city bike, whatever it is, like we know who wins in that scenario. So again, it behooves all of us to think about that as it relates to our work and our goals, but also, we're all in this together. And I know that sounds cheesy, but I think especially now, like New York is on this precipice of many things. And if we don't get transportation right, we're going to be locked in for who knows how many decades of gridlock, Carmageddon, growing pollution, in a moment when we really need to be radically thinking differently about our future and our streets.
Awesome, that's great. I just want to be sure that we leave time for folks to weigh in, ask questions. So would love for folks to, unmute yourself, turn your video on, ask a question directly, or if you want to drop one in the chat, I'm happy to read it out for you as well. But I'll just start with one question. I'd love to hear a little bit of forecasting from the both of you about what we think all of these trends and how a lot of the ridership trends have shifted through the pandemic, how we think that's going to continue or not as we approach winter. Of course, subway ridership and ridership across most modes, if not all modes, really plummeted at the beginning of the pandemic and has sort of slowly been edging back up. Folks are still wary of getting on the subway, even though there have been plenty of studies that have come out in the past several months linking no new clusters or no transmission spread to riding the subway. But still, folks are wary. Do you think once it gets really cold again, are we going to see more people getting back on the subway, or is City Bike expecting ridership to sustain itself through the winter months because of that wariness? Like, what are some of those dynamics you're expecting?
Yeah, I think that there are a few exogenous factors to that too, that I'll add, of just questions of like, will cases be spiking? Will the trajectory of people going back to offices more and more so continue, or will that be halted and regress? Are also questions top of mind. And so I would say we've been more in a scenario-based thinking rather than pure planning phase at the moment. I would say traditionally in winter months, we see a lot of people who are riding as commuters and our members. We see huge resiliency against the cold. So our lowest days in the winter usually have 30,000 or more rides when it's truly cold. I myself rode every day last year, and I think there were 2 days when I didn't ride because it was just too chilly. And so I think we're interested to see, how does that shift between people who had been predominantly, riding during the winter for work, right? And predominantly using it for that mode. How does that shift this winter? So for the people that are continuing to go into offices, will they continue riding? Will people continue riding as leisure commute cases and all of that? So far, we haven't seen reductions in ridership as we've gotten into a little bit chillier, kind of cold weather. I think we'll also be planning to do some how to ride in the winter communications too. It's something that we do a lot of and have done in very fun ways internally of, staff members who do ride, like, what are your favorite items of clothing? Like, what gets you going? Like, how do you start? We've had jousts of like, do you prefer to be like slightly cold versus slightly sweaty when you're riding in the winter? It's a serious question. And so I think that there's all sorts of ways to also think about that and encourage that when we think about winter ridership. But for anyone in this group who's considering it, I can say I wore like a light windbreaker basically every day last winter and would sometimes wear like a vest underneath it, and gloves, and then my helmet as a hat. And so it's all, and boots, and it's all very possible, and actually really enjoyable. I think, as Danny mentioned, like I, love the kind of freedom of being able to ride a bike and that control over your commuting experience, versus the wait times or things like that on other modes. And so being a little bit chilly was always my preferred mode.
Yeah, I think as it relates to, to transit and Carmageddon, so we've seen now 40,000 new cars registered, I believe, since COVID. I think these numbers were as of July, and so we know that these numbers are likely going to grow, especially as we get into winter months. We also see an increase in people driving in from the suburbs. So typically, if you may have a doctor's appointment or you're meeting a friend or you're going to work, in some cases, you may be more likely to drive in. Again, the car is the new PPE. I think there's a reality where for people who do have options, especially if there is some type of a subsidy from their employer to take, for hire vehicle, we imagine that we will see that as well. But at the same time, I go back to my opening equation: if space minus cars equals quality of life. If commute times were terrible before, just think of how much worse they will be with even 2% more cars, or 1% of the people not riding the subway, but taking a Lyft or Uber or their own car. Like, New York cannot sustain this. So I think there's a reality that yes, we will probably see traffic continue to pick up. And now we're, especially on bridge crossings, I think we may have even crossed the threshold of where we were pre-COVID levels. And again, New York is still not fully reopened. I don't know how many of you are working from home right now, but we are. I mean, even if transportation alternatives was open, we probably would not all be driving our SUV to work. I don't know how many of us even own cars, but yeah, I think we sort of expect that as an unfortunate reality, but also recognizing that people's safety is paramount. So we have to balance that and give people realistic options about how to get around.
Great. Want to give anybody else an opportunity to jump in here?
It looks like there's a question here from Sarah Brown.
Yeah, there is a question from Sarah. Of course, Sarah mentions that we have a mayoral race coming up in New York City. Mayor de Blasio is term limited out. And wanting to know if you are hearing from any of the candidates anything interesting to your world or transit. Sarah mentions the paid parking question in particular. But are you hearing anything about that with regards to the city's recovery and some of the recovery plans that any of those candidates have? Or, what sort of priorities would you like to be hearing from the candidates, moving into 2021?
Sure. So we're actually amidst leading into focus groups and polling on this from TA and other transit advocates. And so, I think we have our own sense of what this could potentially be, which is really around, streets as this pathway to recovery and, broadening the tent, especially now as we have more than 10,000 restaurants that are part of this Open Streets Coalition, and, schools, cultural institutions. I mean, everybody in New York is seeking space. I mean, look, I think if you are a New Yorker and you haven't had the dream where like you wake up and there's another bedroom in your house and you're the happiest you've ever been in your life, then, hopefully you'll stay here long enough to have it. But, I think now businesses are starting to have those same dreams, and they're starting to look outside at their street and saying, well, why is all that space devoted to free parking? Or, do we really need that many lanes on Second Avenue? So, our goals are to, work with a broad coalition on advancing a platform that, puts safety paramount and also helps us to reimagine what our streets look like. And Laura had mentioned things like curb reform, which are, big and challenging. And I would add things like trash reform. I mean, it doesn't help when you have, Himalayan sized piles of garbage outside of your, however much you're paying in rent in your office or your home. So these are really big things that there are solutions to, and it requires the leadership to do so. So I think for us, we would like to recapture, some significant percentage of street space and give it back to New Yorkers. And we want to put that on the ballot and have mayors run with it. And I think within that, there are plans, as Laura had mentioned, about how you price for parking, how you bring congestion pricing to New York, which, God willing, will come when we can sort it out with the feds. But, there are real serious ideas that work, and we just need to bring them to New York. And the people in New York, they kind of hated things at first, from the Times Square change to protected bike lanes. And now you have people who are basically saying, why haven't we gotten that after X number of years? So I think really it's the opportunity to scale our success.
Yeah, I don't know if Laura, you want to weigh in there, but I would love to also hear more about what's up with congestion pricing. I know it's gotten installed at the federal level. Do any of you have any predictions about when and if that's going to move? And also, just to pair the congestion pricing piece with sort of a larger question about the role of the federal level in transit support in general. The CARES Act, the government is currently requesting large, as Laura said, B word, billions of dollars of support from the federal government to support the infrastructure we currently have. Are we totally reliant on that? Should we be holding out for that? What's up with all of that stuff?
I think anybody who's a prognosticator who believed that they could predict the world, maybe starting in 2016 or before, hopefully shouldn't continue to be doing so. I think, like Laura, we're going through various scenario plannings internally, but I think there are a lot of things that need to move for congestion pricing to happen. And it's, at least we see it as being locked in at the federal level with DOT as it relates to, some federal funding that had gone to New York City's roads. I think we're also seeing some creative ideas that are still in early stages of incubation of, if the feds don't advance and if we have another Trump administration, of what are other, legal avenues that New York could pursue to still advance that in some form, where it would either be sort of at a state or a local or state level. And I guess I would just sort of add on top of that, and Laura, I'm really curious what you're hearing and what you're thinking is, I think that I'm all for congestion pricing. It should have happened a long time ago. And I also am a little bit concerned about, the optics of it now. Like, it's certainly needed. We need the revenue. We need to reduce cars. I also can sort of see, because so much of our work is about the politics, is this the issue that local council members are going to want to get behind, of taxing people going back into commercial business districts that have been struggling, that need people to go back, where the employers are saying, hey, we need options. So I still think, once we do cross that federal hurdle, I still don't think we're fully out of the woods on, locally what that means for us in terms of our own recovery.
Yeah, totally agree that once it passes at federal level, the timeline for it to actually be implemented in New York is going to take time. I think even the kind of technical implementation and rollout is estimated to be about a year after it gets approved at a federal level. And to Danny's point, the politics of that last step in New York City, I think, are going to take time. And I think examples like Singapore, for example, point to the fact that, no matter how much talk there is and what the right price should be, structure, all of that, we're probably going to get it wrong the first time. Although there's going to be a lot of effort to get it right. And so what does it look like to set up something that, instead of trying to get it right all at once, takes more of an iterative approach, right? And says, okay, let's really test what this pricing mechanism looks like. Let's make sure that people who are coming in from and one of the mistakes that Singapore made was, and to Danny's point on equity issues, like people who are coming in from further were paying higher prices. They didn't have the best transportation options to actually get them there. And so there was toggling based on like origination location as well. So I think that there's a lot to learn from some of those implementations in the past. And I think when it is implemented in New York, setting up a system for a clear test and learn approach is going to be essential to not only passing it initially, but getting it right so that it stays in the long term.
Great, yeah, and I think, I know we're coming up on just a couple of more minutes here. So given the fact that I know a bunch of the folks on the call are, from like startups that do street intelligence and other sorts of transit applications, wanted to ask you both where you think we need more data about our streets. What sort of insights do you wish you had that folks on the line might be able to help you with?
I'm going to share two. So one is we need it at a hyper local level. I still feel like when we're engaged in this trench warfare of going neighborhood to neighborhood, it's still really hard to find the data of how mobility impacts specific communities, especially about depending on what their needs are. And I think this is tremendous in terms of bringing about the type of change that's required at a city or state level, because still so many of these issues will come down to the community board side. So I think those dashboards or ways that you can take it to a council member and say, hey, here's what this issue looks like specifically in your district, the number of people killed, the air quality, mobility options. So I'd say that's one. I think the second is, and I still don't really fully understand how to describe this, so I'm just going to say it and hopefully it'll make sense. But I think COVID was like that red and blue pill from the Matrix for most New Yorkers, where they, among so many other things, they could look outside of their window and see how much of the city was given away to car movement and storage, among so many other tragedies. This is obviously a much smaller one. And I think people are understanding this and they're using it as some point of, individually or for a business or for a neighborhood. And we still haven't fully understand like how to empower that, like how to turn that into something that people can start to use, even at a higher level to advocate for their own success and what it is that they need. And I say, especially as it relates at the council member level, where we're going to see 34 seats turnover in 2021. So I think, how the data can be effective in terms of helping people see it from a quantitative perspective, but also that huge sort of qualitative shift that most people have seen and turning those into kind of the big campaigns and ideas that help to move the city forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with both of those, and really like Danny's focus on the hyper local level too, that really affects decision making in New York. A couple more that are top of mind for me. One, just knowledge of the curb. I think the stat that Danny and I spoke about earlier of 75% of street space being dedicated to vehicles is not well known. It's, the RPA has done these studies, many other organizations have. I think we've experienced a lot of pushback of how much percentage of the curb City Bike occupies, and actually use core data spaces to look at that real number, and it's 0.5% of the total curb. And people have talked about open restaurants as being, taking up too much parking, and different studies have seen their percentage of curb at 0.3% of the total curb to 0.8% of the total curb. And so just having some good fact bases for these conversations that have a source of data that people agree with, I think is number one. And then I think number two, just desired state would be some kind of almost gamification that allows you to see if you were to change roads in certain ways or grow subways, like what would that look like? And how many more people could you move? Because I think that kind of simulation would really help people understand how these kinds of decisions actually translate to moving people in a city. A big learning for me early in my career was I was consulting for the Mexico City Department of Urban Planning and Housing, and they had been in a situation in which Mexico City has become incredibly unaffordable. A lot of the affordable housing has been pushed to the outskirts, And the city came with a question of how do we increase affordable housing? And when we actually built a big financial model for them and looked at regulations on private developer incentives, we found that it's actually their own regulations that were preventing developers from, actually building affordable or middle income housing. And so I think in the same way about a lot of these decisions of how do we actually equip people with the right tools to build scenarios to see, okay, if I change percentage of road space dedicated to vehicles versus buses versus bikes and others, how many people can I move in my city? What would that look like for my neighborhood? I can imagine something like that being incredibly empowering for both top-down decision-making as well as hyper-local decision-making.
Great. We are at the end of the hour, so I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining. Everyone who's here on the call is connected to me via my email, via the calendar invite. So if there are any connections that I can help facilitate moving forward post-call, Tech NYC is certainly here to help. And stay tuned for the next invitation in our little series, which will be coming to you for November 17th. And in between then, thank you very much, Danny, Laura, for joining us. And thanks to everyone that tuned in for the call.
Thanks, Tyler, for having us. Okay, thanks,
See
guys.
everybody later.
Stay safe.
Bye.